start our discussion here, start our presentation. So I thank you everyone for coming. This is such a great turnout. My name is Don Baskin. I'm kind of the host today. I'm real honored to be the host here, to introduce Professor Eagar. I'm just going to start with sort of a very short biography of what Professor Eagar has done and so forth. Professor Eagar was born during the happy days in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He began his Bachelor's of Science at MIT here in 1967. He finished up that Bachelor's of Science in 1972 and then went on to graduate school to get a BSc, which I guess, me being from a different school, that's the same as a PhD. I guess he had enough of academia for that point in time, and he decided to go work at Bethlehem Steel. So he moved to Pennsylvania and worked there for a couple of years. He got an MBA at Lehigh University. And then I guess he decided that industry was annoying, and he went back to MIT, and he was here as a full professor, or he was here as a starting professor for a couple of years. He then spent some time in Japan working for the Navy. Then he came back to MIT, and then I believe in 1987, is that right? You got tenure?
84.
84, okay, 84 was tenure. And then he was the department head of the Department of Material Science from 1995 to 2000. And shortly after he finished up his duty as the department head, I'd say he rose to national prominence in some articles about the destruction of the World Trade Centers in New York after the 2011 or 2001 bombings or airplane strikes. So there was a lot of conspiracy theories going on after the Twin Towers came down, that somehow the United States government must have put thermite at the base of those towers, because why else would they crash like that? And there was a lot of, sound familiar, guys, conspiracy theories? There's a lot of conspiracy theories going on about how that happened, and it was somebody's fault, and it's a conspiracy, and this and that. And Professor Eagar was brave enough to stand and say, no, the data you're presenting doesn't necessarily say it had to have been some terrorist attack or some conspiracy that brought down the towers. In fact, it really is possible that due to the fire from the fuel that came out of the planes that hit the towers, there would be enough heat there that the material would be compromised. The steel that made up the structure would be compromised, and that alone would be enough to have the tower collapse. And not only that it would collapse, but it would collapse straight down and not necessarily to the side. And he published a very interesting article on this, which I've recently read, and it makes sense to me. Professor Eagar has won a zillion awards. There must be a list of 50 of them on the German Wikipedia website. And I'm not going to list all of them here, but I am going to say that he became an ASM Fellow in 1989, and he became an American Welding Society Fellow in 1994, and then he was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 1997. Since then, he has taught structural materials engineering here at MIT in the department, and some people call him the Rosetta Stone at MIT because he knows so much about what happened here. So, without further ado, I'll invite Professor Eagar up here to start his presentation. He's going to talk about the history of the Department of Material Science and Engineering here at MIT. And I think this is going to be a lot of fun. There's lots of stories here about different professors and what they did and how they got here and their research. And so I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you, Don. First, I had no idea how many people would be here, but I brought something that I give out in class for the last 10 years that I've tried to get MIT to give out to all the freshmen, okay? So if you're a student, you can take one. I have some more in my office, and if you check with Maria Giovanni, she can probably, I'll show her where they are. And the faculty can take them if you want. It's called Career Anchors. I didn't do it until 1988 when I read it the first time in a course that I took over at the Sloan School. And the course basically, or a career anchor, is something that was invented by Professor Shine to help people figure out what is the one thing you will not give up when faced with a choice in your career. Okay? There's 40 questions in there. You can fill them out. I can't tell you to Xerox the page of questions because that's illegal. It's copyrighted, right, Steve? Anyway.
Not if it's for educational purposes.
Okay, you can Xerox them if you want. Because these things cost the department $15 a piece, okay? But in any case, I give them out in class. And this is when students come to me for advice about what you should do in your career. I can't give you advice on what to do in your career. You're going to have to decide that yourself. But I give them the career anchors and say, figure out what your career anchor is, okay? And I basically tell stories about things. And I could tell some of those stories, but that'll be for the class. Now, it turns out I originally thought that this was mostly going to be to faculty, but I knew that a lot of people would want to hear what I have to say because throughout my career, certainly my career on the faculty, I've been known for saying provocative things. In fact, I've tried to say provocative things because I want people to think about things. And so there is a part one. Someone asked, why is see part two? I did write a part one, and I gave it in class last Wednesday. And it basically goes from 1863 through 1972 or 1975 and traces the name of the department. It started out as a geology department. There was no metallurgy until 1888. In fact, here is a book, and a lot of this stuff that I might talk about today, or some of it, is in this book by Michael Bever, who was a professor in the department. Mert Flemings, when he became department head, commissioned a ton of these books, and we had a big event trying to raise money from the alumni. This is a history of the Department of Material Science and Engineering, the 100-year anniversary from 1888 to 1988. You can buy it on Amazon for $40 now. I should have kept more of them. I think the department threw away a couple of hundred of them not too long ago, but they might have them. In any case, some of the things came from that. But what I wanted to do is tell you some things about the history of the department. And in fact, if you're really interested, we're going to be videotaping about 6 lectures in my class this semester. Because as I got into this, there's too much to tell in 1 hour. So what I'm going to talk about right now is basically what happened with mentoring and how it's changed in the department. And I see that I have a number of colleagues who have been through this, and so if you don't believe some of these things, you can check with them. Why do we need to study history, and why am I talking about the history of the department rather than my career as a welder? Well, I don't care much about my career as a welder now that I'm retired. It really makes no difference. And I have a whole wall full of awards. You know what's going to happen to those awards when I finally leave that office? They're going to go in the trash can. And my kids don't care about them. I got 7 children and 29 grandchildren, but none of them want them, okay? And frankly, I don't care about them much anymore. I don't look at those very often. But awards can be important to you as an aspiring academic because other people measure you on these awards. Not that you should be measured on these awards, but you will be measured on these awards, okay? So in the 1930s, which is as far back as I could go, MIT was predominantly an undergraduate institution. And the mentoring came from the top. And there's only 2 slides for the 20 years from 1930 to 1950. But Carl Taylor Compton appointed John Slater in the physics department as the head of the Department of Physics. Slater had been a student of P.W. Bridgman. You may not know who P.W. Bridgman was, but he won the Nobel Prize at Harvard. He was a high-pressure physicist, okay? Very well known in the United States, one of the first U.S. Nobel Prize winners in physics. Slater was a solid-state and molecular theorist. You know, Bohr didn't explain the Bohr atom, but no one could explain the hydrogen molecule, the H2 molecule. Slater calculated the hydrogen molecule in the 1920s or 1930s. So he is a specialist in quantum mechanics. But another area was microwave transmission. And if you know anything about MIT's history during World War II, MIT perfected the radar in World War II. It is because of Slater. Slater was that's why the British sent the Klystron over to the United States in 1939. And it came, if you go look in room 4131, it's got a plaque on the outside, said this was the home of the MIT radiation lab. And 3,000 people worked there, and I always thought that was my lab once. That was pretty crowded with 3,000 people there. But it turns out they had buildings all over Boston and other places back then. Anyway, so Slater was a very powerful person, and Slater decided that he was going to recast. Things came from the top down in these days at MIT. He recast the undergraduate physics curriculum, and he wanted to get rid of all the applied physics faculty. He wanted to send them to the School of Engineering, and he and Compton had the power to do that, okay, across school lines and everything else. One of the people, and I heard this from Doc Draper in a talk that I was attended. Doc Draper was hired, he was a physics student, and he was hired in 1938, and he thought he was hired to work in the physics department. He went to meet Slater, and Slater said, "I've sent you over to the Aero and Astro department. You're going to be working over there." Doc Draper started something that eventually became the Instrumentation Laboratory, which you now today know as the Draper Laboratory. And it's not even part of MIT, but it's a more than $1 billion federal facility. And the Draper Laboratory, Instrumentation Laboratory, built all the MERV guidance system. I was a student at the time, and the students would protest about the multiple independently targeted nuclear weapons that was going to give us a huge advantage over the Soviet Union and the race for space. But Draper was sent over there. He made his name in World War II perfecting bomb sites, okay? Then there was a guy, John Wolfe, in 1937. John Wolfe is my academic grandfather. John Wolfe, my thesis advisor was Bob Rose, and Bob Rose's thesis advisor was John Wolfe. John Wolfe's thesis advisor was Gerlach of the Stern-Gerlach experiment. John Wolfe was a metal physicist, and he had been hired to come into the physics department at MIT. Slater didn't want him. And in fact, MIT went out and got a big contract from Alfred Sloan of the Sloan Foundation and gave the money to John Wolfe in 1951 to build the metals processing lab. Does anyone know what building is called the metals processing lab? It has a big concrete thing on it. Yep.
Is that the one that the Aero and Astro department currently occupies over?
Yep, it's building 35, right on the corner of Mass Ave and Vassar. Look up there. It says metals processing lab. That was John Wolfe's lab. He was given the money by Alfred Sloan, and it turns out, I'll tell you some more about that in a little bit. That was building 35, and they did practical, applied things like sintering, foundry, and welding. And then there was a guy, Francis Bitter. Anybody worked at the National Magnet Lab or the Bitter Lab? I did my doctoral thesis there.
We're using the space.
Oh, you're using the space over there, but the original space was the basement of Building 4. When I was here, it was a graphite machine shop, but the first Bitter coils were right there in the basement of Building 4, okay? And Francis Bitter, they ended up building the National Magnet Laboratory. They had the highest field magnets in the world, okay? So anyway, in the 1930s, what they were doing at MIT with the senior people basically telling the young scientist, well, you're not going to work in physics. You're going to go work in Aero and Astro, or you're going to go work in metals processing. That was very common because each professor back then, these were all mostly undergraduate institutions, and only a professor, I mean, I had 29 PhDs in my tenure at MIT that did their thesis for me. A typical professor back then would only do 2 or 3 PhDs in their entire career. This was an undergraduate institution in the 1950s until a little bit later in 1957. I'll talk about that. And to tell you some more stories about this, even when I took my sabbatical in Japan in 1985, in the Japanese system, they had something called COSA. And the young professors, if they were hired to work in academia, they would be working in a group of 4. There'd be a senior professor, an assistant professor, and 2 research associates. And the 2 research associates basically did the research work, and the other 2 were kind of administrators, okay? The same type of thing happened in Britain. I've talked to people in Australia, as I was talking to them, I said, well, how'd you get this job in Australia? They said, well, when I graduated from Cambridge, my professor said, you've got a job in Australia, and they sent them to Australia, okay? That's how you got your job if you wanted to be in academia back in the 50s, or the 60s in Britain and Japan. At MIT, I heard this story from Gus Witt himself, so I know it's true, and I've confirmed it with Bob Rose. Gus Witt in 1962 was hired at MIT as an assistant professor to work on mineral dressing. This had been the geology department and geology and metallurgy, and we had a very big program in ore dressing. I'll show you some pictures of that in a little bit. But this is how you take the rock out of the ground and you refine it. I just read a paper in the New York Times today about lithium in Quebec. Okay, but that was a big deal. Mining was the heart and soul of this department in 1865, and it was still a part of the department. But sometime in about 1960, as they were revising the department, they voted to get rid of mineral dressing. And Phil de Bruyne was one of the top experts. He was a charter member of the National Academy of Engineering in 1965, and there were only 17 people. So he was a very well-known, very prominent engineer. But he was from Holland, and then the department had decided, we're not going to continue with mineral dressing. We're not going to have that program in the future. So he decided to go back to Holland. This was 1968, and Gus and Tom King had become department head, and he called Gus Witt into his office and said, Gus, I want you to go see Harry Gatos. Harry Gatos had come from Lincoln Lab, where he'd been an MIT graduate student and undergraduate. He'd gone to Lincoln Lab and become head of the solid state division. Harry Gatos later was called the father of gallium arsenide. He was working on gallium arsenide before we even know what a cell phone was, okay? So Gus Witt goes over to see Harry Gatos, and Harry Gatos says, you're going to be working on growing silicon single crystals from mineral dressing, okay? This is the way it was done, folks. I can't tell you to go ask Gus because he's passed away, but Gus told me the story, and as I put this in my thing, Bob Rose said, oh yeah, that's right. Gus was a mineral dresser, okay? They were assistant professors together. That was the way you were mentored. You were told what your professional position was going to be. Then came 1957, and this was a huge shock to the United States. We thought we were the best in the world in science. Who was the best in the world in science in 1920? What country? Germany. If you look at the MIT curriculum, you'll find that you had to take German. It was required in this department. If you wanted to read scientific papers, you needed to be able to read German because all the great science was done in Germany. Think of all the names in quantum mechanics, okay, and things. Well, it turns out in 1957, we had kind of thought we had taken over with the Manhattan Project and the Rad Lab and a lot of other things that came out of World War II. And the people in Washington thought we were great. They formed in 1947 the Office of Naval Research, which was the predecessor to the National Science Foundation a couple of years later. And they were modeling after some of the faculty who were doing some of these things at MIT and Stanford and Berkeley back in those days. Well, it turns out in '57 the Soviets sent a dog around the world in a spacecraft, and the United States was shocked that the Soviets got in space before we did. And so Congress decided to pour money into what they called what were the research universities, the Stanfords, the MITs, Harvard was part of it, Berkeley, Caltech. They were pouring money at them, and I remember this quote here, while you're up, get me a grant, was something Bob Rose, my thesis advisor, used to say. Money was flowing out of Washington, okay? And people would joke and say, while you're up, like, give me a cup of coffee, give me a grant. it was very easy to get a grant out of Washington. It turns out within 4 or 5 years, the graduate population expanded tenfold from a few hundreds to a few thousands of graduate students. MIT was no longer an undergraduate institution, it was a graduate and an undergraduate institution. And the demand for lab space exploded. Building 13 was built by the Department of Defense. It was later given to the National Science Foundation in 1972 when they decided the Department of Defense could only work on war, and that Building 13 was not a war college. So they basically turned it over to the National Science Foundation, who basically is responsible for a lot of the grants and things that come out of Building 13 today. But the materials labs were 4, 8, and 13, and Building 35 became a mechanical engineering department. When I was hired in 1976, if I sent a proposal to Washington, I would have a 50% chance of being funded at the NSF. Anyone else from anything that wasn't one of the research universities, Stanford or Caltech or whatever, they'd only have a 25% chance. About 10 years later, Congress got involved and started earmarking funds to their states' colleges and things. But in any case, that was the growth that all occurred in about a 10-year period from 57 to 67. And I was the tail end of a lot of hiring that was done between 67 and 76. Harry Tuller was one of the people hired at that time. Ron Latanison, who I don't think any of you know, but he was hired at that time. Roland Cannon. You can go through Bever's book and you can see the names of the people that were hired, okay? When I remember as a student, I used to hear the rumor that MIT was not someone where a young faculty member or a young person who wanted to be a faculty member wanted to go, because MIT would hire 2 assistant professors in the same field and let them compete for the tenure slot. That was the rumor. I never saw it, but I heard it from so many places that I pretty much confirmed that it was true in the 1950s. But it turns out by the 1965, the department was growing so fast and so much new money, they couldn't do that anymore. But that's what they did in the early days. And if you look at that, it turns out a lot of changes were going on in the 60s because of the change from Sputnik. Breedis and Russell were 2 of my professors, okay? Morris Cohen was the mentor for Breedis, and John Kahn was the mentor for Ken Russell. Frederick Taylor was a foundryman, and Mel Adams and Mert Flemings were his 2 junior faculty. John Chipman had Elliott and King, both of whom have named professorships right now. John Wolfe had the Building 35 Metals Processing Lab, and he had a bunch of people because he had this Ford Foundation grant. The Ford Foundation was throwing some money at MIT to try to become more scientific rather than a school of applied engineering. And I'm showing you a picture of this is the basement of Building 8 in 1945, where they would do, they were casting things. It was 2-story labs. And it turns out they got some money from the Ford Foundation and they double-decked it. And when you walk down the Infinite Corridor, where the Nano Lab is, that would be right up in the air somewhere there, okay? And another thing is John Wolfe got some money to hire a bunch of junior faculty members, and he started writing the Wolfe series, The Structure and Property. There were 4 books. Those were my freshman textbooks in 3091, were the John Wolfe series. That was something that brought Don Sadoway to MIT. He had studied out of the Wolfe series, and he used to say that was why he came to MIT. This was a new way of looking at material science and engineering. And now we have some quotes from Bob, these aren't quotes from Bob Rose, but with such easy funding, MIT science and engineering expanded beyond the tuition limits for salary. Each professor, when I was hired in 1976, The day I came, I was expected to pay 4.5 months of my academic year salary, and if I wanted to get paid in the summer, I was supposed to have money for another 2 months. Where was I going to get that? I didn't have any research money. But in fact, what would happen is you would be paired with some more senior faculty member who would provide you that funding. And you can ask some of these other people who funded that. Harry, I bet you were funded partly by Kingery in Coble. But anyway, it changed the character and the culture of MIT. The faculty in the schools of engineering and science expected that they would only have to teach 1 course a term. Why? Before that, they had to teach 2 courses a term. But when you now had hired practically double the number of faculty because of all this money coming from Washington, faculty only had to teach 1 course a term because they were only being paid for 1 course a term. Everything else was coming out of the research money. But you created a 2-class society. The administrators got paid for 12 months rather than 9 months, and they had a lot of perks, and those perks still exist, so far as that goes, between administrators and regular faculty in terms of research money and stuff. So they created research monies to do that. In 1959, Gordon Brown, I think he was an Australian, maybe a New Zealander, but he became Dean of Science. And he decided he was going to take this trend of increasing the science. And Flemings, who had graduated in 1954 and was coming up for tenure in 1960, had to completely revamp his portfolio of research, which was very applied solidification foundry technology, and he had to sell himself as a solidification scientist, okay? I mean, I've heard Flemings tell me this himself. It was fairly traumatic to have to change your career 1 year before the tenure decision, okay? In the meantime, Wolf's Metal Processing Lab over in Building 35, they had 10 technicians, full-time paid people. They had a furnace. I never saw this furnace, but it could melt 10 tons of steel, okay? Ed Backman was the foreman. I worked for Ed Backman for a year, okay? As you can call it a Europe student, but it was before Europe. That's another story. But anyway, they were able to cast the gimbals, and I couldn't find a picture of the MIT gimbals. But these are gimbals. Basically, gimbals are a 3-phase compliant structure that you would use for the Apollo or the Mercury spacecraft. And MIT was the only place in the world that could cast these. We are the only people who had the technology, which was basically Mert Flemings and the other people. And they had foremen to do all this work. So MIT was a little factory over there. I bet very few people in this room can explain to me why that's a difficult structure to cast. Okay, but it has to do with heat flow. I'm sorry. But you don't take much heat flow anymore. So the junior faculty member was expected to pursue their own research, to help write proposals for the senior people. After all, they were busy doing other things, like sailing around the world. Some of them were. Bob Ogilvy sailed around the world, okay? To develop their own reputation in their field, separate of the senior faculty member, because they were going to be judged to see if they were different than the senior professor. You had to show that you had some new thing to bring to the table. And if you didn't find the right time to kind of break away from this, you could not get tenure. Because back then, and I saw the letters when I was department head in the files, one professor, a senior professor, would write to the department and said, I think we ought to give so-and-so tenure. Well, that's not how it's done today, folks. Now it goes through hours and hours of discussion in the department, at engineering council. But back then, if one of the senior mentors said, I think this person should get tenure, they'd put them up for tenure, okay? Today, it's a much more arduous process, and actually it's probably a fairer process, because sometimes this would be abused, okay? It wasn't until 1983 when Flemings became department head, and you remember the trauma that Flemings went through a few years earlier. Flemings instituted the career development committees, which we've had ever since. And I don't think the career development committees really work like they should, but they do a lot better than one senior professor saying to another senior professor, I don't think we're going to promote so-and-so, or I think we ought to give so-and-so tenure, okay? It was a very tenuous system. And I'll tell you that I could go through and talk about what happened to women and minority faculty. Well, we didn't have very many women, and we had basically almost no minorities. And they got virtually no mentoring in 1980 or whatever, although I wasn't supposed to know about that. Okay, a lot of what you saw was, this is Bob Rose and what he wrote to me. The shadow of World War II and the Manhattan Project. Dave Kingery's funding originated there. Howard Taylor got his money from the Foundrymen. Mel Adams from the American Welding Society. The Institute was in many respects a hostile environment, making numerous demands on faculty, junior and senior. In mid-century MIT, a faculty member was required to be a profit center, to produce positive cash flow. That's not necessarily all that different, but it's different on a different order of magnitude. I was expected my first year to come up with 6.5 months of salary for myself out of research and pay the overhead on that. The overhead on his immediate activities had to cover his academic salary. Here's a typical, and Bob gave me a typical situation. You were not permitted to purchase graphic arts from outside vendors. Your purchase order would not be issued by MIT. The graphics for your publication had to be produced by MIT Graphic Arts. MIT was using this to skim off, okay? Graphic Arts would not produce material acceptable for something like the Physical Review, which is where Bob published. Typically inadequately sized lettering. Sounds trivial, doesn't it? Not if you wanted to publish your work, not if you wanted to keep your job. The solution was an underground network of MIT personnel who produced excellent results and were paid under the table, out of pocket or by misrepresentation. I don't want to tell you this, but we do the same thing today. But we have a lot more administrators trying to keep us from doing it. Financial management of grant and contract funding was full of impossible situations and catch-22s. That's still true, okay, which were also dealt with by subterfuge, and in some cases by collusion with the grantee and the grantor to circumvent the MIT administration. If you could convince your contract monitor in Washington you could do it, they'd let you do it, okay? Would I have survived without a mentor or a godfather? Doubtful and improbable. As I recall, there were something like 36 brand new assistant professors in June 1961 in the School of Engineering. And of these, 3 survived to become full profs, including me. And that was, I think, Rose and Wolf in this department. Soon after we became assistant profs, John Wolf dragged George Pearsall and me to Washington to make the rounds and beg for funds as we needed research funding, especially after the Ford Foundation postdoc ran out. It worked. Stressful, depressing, but it bore fruit. Would it have occurred to me to do that? And could I have done it on my own? I don't think so. Bob's conclusion, given the environment at MIT in the 1960s and the department 60 years ago, I needed a patron in order to survive. Is futile, and that's a word that I put in what I gave to Bob originally, an appropriate descriptor to describe that environment. A more accurate parallel might be Italy at the time of the Medici. I was also rescued by changes at MIT. Tom King, a Scotsman with a great sense of humor, okay, became department head. He went out of his way to help me. Without Tom, I don't get promoted or even reappointed. For my first 3 years, I had 1-year contracts. At least I had 3-year contracts, okay? And Paul Gray ascended and became the best president MIT we have had. He changed the character of MIT for the better. Some of these changes were forced by the granting agencies, particularly the NSF. They were the ones who had to force things on MIT. Bob's conclusion, leadership matters, character matters. Okay, changing to MIT in 1976, when I was hired, had morphed into a system with junior faculty assigned to senior faculty who were mentors and patrons who provided financial support for 50% of the salary for the junior faculty who assisted the senior faculty. The word I had in there when I had serf, with feudal, I also had the word serf, okay? Because that's how I felt about this thing. Research money was power. I don't think that's really changed too much, okay? The autocratic system in 1976, Walter Owen was the department head, and he said at one of the first faculty meetings that I was at, it's department head at MIT, not department chairman, meaning decisions were not made democratically at MIT. The mentor and the department head would decide junior faculty promotions. I've talked about that. Some mentors were altruistic. Wolf was a good guy, Taylor's a good guy, Gatos was a good guy, Kingery is a good guy. Not all the others were such good guys, okay? And some of them extracted a lot of pain and suffering from those junior faculty. Headquarters provided no funds to junior faculty. The mentor was expected to help the mentee with 4.5 to 6.5 months of salary from the start. There were only 2 endowed chairs in the department, the Ford chair and the ABEX chair. Junior faculty wrote funding proposals for the mentors in their spare time while they weren't trying to get their own scientific reputations developed. The assistant professor received the salary support from the mentor. Some assistant professors graduated doctoral students in their first year. Well, how do you do that unless your mentor just kind of passes on this person to you? But we could go back and find examples of that. The assistant professor shared lab space from the senior faculty holdings. Harry Teller's nodding. Okay. The senior faculty fought one another continually for space. There were always space wars. Okay. The department did not own any research space of its own, really. It had some lab space, but not much. And we don't have to go through this. This is just a list of different faculty who had funding sources in the 1965 timeframe. The initial breach of the system came in 1968 when Tom King, the new department head, selected Ken Russell over John Breedis for tenure, defying the mentor of Morris Cohen in favor of Kahn's preference, who was Ken Russell. Ken Russell always said that he was the one who broke the system. But he had a patron. Maybe John Wolfe was not much of a patron. He never brought in much money for himself, nor anyone else. And mostly he just gave kind of disjointed lectures about his prior research. But nonetheless, Ken Russell was the department's selection, or the department head selection, rather than Morris Cohen's selection. Okay, so I'm going to go back to what happened to me. In 1970, I was an undergraduate in the department, and I actually had started out doing the equivalent of UROP before UROP existed my sophomore year. By the time I completed, in the next 2.5 years, completed my bachelor's thesis, I had helped 5 PhDs finish their thesis. So I knew how to get work done in the lab, okay? Because I tied myself to a couple of these technicians that they used to have. A guy named Puffer was the one who really taught me, but Ed Backman used to take me out to get cohogs. He would have beer, but I don't drink alcohol, but he dragged me down to have cohogs and when he was going out with the graduate students and stuff. I became the undergraduate student representative of the Morris Cohen Committee that revised the undergraduate curriculum. I was going to meetings with these faculty and listening to them talk to each other. I got to know them and their personalities. And in 1972, when I became a graduate student, I became the student representative on the graduate student committee, the Bernie Wunsch committee, that revised the graduate curriculum. So even more faculty. I got to know these faculty pretty well. In 72 through 74, I was a graduate student. I had an NSF fellowship, but I volunteered to teach because I thought maybe someday I'd like to teach. And I TA'd for John Wolfe, Tom King, Keith Johnson, Eric Baer, Morris Cohen, and Kent Bowen. I taught 321. I had taken it as an undergraduate, and I TA'd it as a graduate student, okay? Having observed the politics at MIT firsthand, when I graduated, I used to say the last thing I would ever want to do was come back to MIT as an assistant professor and get dumped on, okay? So what happens 2 years later? I guess I had finished everything else in the world, and Mert Flemings asked me if I ever thought about being a faculty member. My response, and I was always known for being pretty blunt, you mean get dumped on like Bob Moravian, who had just been denied tenure? A spot had been opened up. If you don't know Bob Moravian left MIT with a full professorship at University of Illinois, Urbana. He went to the National Institute of Standards and Technology, heading up the material science program, 400 people. He went to Santa Barbara as dean. He went to Carnegie Mellon as president. He ended up becoming chairman of Allegheny Teledyne. So Bob had a pretty successful career. And Bob and I knew each other really well because I had been an undergraduate grunt working in Fleming's lab under Bob, okay? That's a whole nother set of stories, okay? But anyway, Fleming's asked me, and when I said, you mean get dumped on like Bob Moravian? You could just see the steam coming out of Fleming's ears when I said that. Bob Moravian and Mert Flemings never got along after that, okay, after Bob Moravian didn't get tenure. They basically hated each other, okay? But Fleming's response was, fairly calmly, you can advance your career faster at MIT than anywhere else. I find that's true. You can. If you're offered a faculty position and you're willing to give up a lot of things, not everything, you can advance your career faster here than anywhere else. And I said, what about tenure? He said, don't worry about tenure. I responded, okay. So Tom Eagar came to MIT with a bad attitude, a really bad attitude, let me tell you. I didn't care about whether I got tenure. I didn't mind whatever I said to whatever senior faculty member or junior faculty member or people in other departments. And I got myself in trouble constantly for speaking my mind. I wasn't attacking people. I thought I was attacking issues. But if you look through the department in 1980, you've got Dave Kingery helped mentor Kent Bowen and Yet Ming Chang. And I can go down the list. Down here, Eagar had no financial mentor, okay? Because I chose not to have a financial mentor. I didn't want the strings attached to being someone's financial mentor. As a result, I had no salary support. I had no laboratory space. I only had $50 in first-year discretionary funds. And that's because I went to Fleming's and said, I don't have any money to copy my proposals. And you had to send 20 copies of your proposals to Washington, okay? And we didn't have digital ways to do that. So Fleming said, well, I'll give you $50, but let me know if you, or he said, I'll give you an account number, but let me know if you spend more than $50. That was it for my freshman year. I went to Walter Owen, the department head. I told you the department didn't give the junior faculty anything. He said, we'll give you an advance on your ILO funds. So they're going to give me a loan in the future if I worked for it and earned some money some other way. Joe Dosey was the department administrator, and he said, well, you can go ask some secretaries to give you some stamps so you can send your mail. So I was supposed to go beg for stamps. The good thing about that, I was only 26 years old. I looked like a graduate student. And I would go up to the secretaries and I'd say, well, can I see Professor so-and-so? And they'd try to pass me off and give me some bull about he's busy or whatever. And I said, oh, just tell him Professor Eagar came by. And they'd look up. They didn't think I was a professor. So anyway, they learned. I shared an office, the one that has Hoppeton on it, 8137 with a bunch of graduate students. The little short door down there. That was my office. I was third in line. We don't have to go through the secretarial support. But to prove this, you say, how could that be? It turns out I received a letter back in 2020 from a guy at Oregon Graduate Center who was retiring. And he said, I'm sending you this letter. Bill Wood sent me the letter. And he said, because I received it back in May of 77, May 1977, from the president of Oregon Graduate Center. Turns out the associate dean of engineering said, oh, by the way, we hired this guy, Tom Eagar, and he's okay, but he probably isn't going to get tenure here. And I know you're looking for someone in welding, so why don't you invite him out to see if he measures up to Oregon Graduate Center, okay? They had to have made this decision within 6 months of hiring me, okay? It didn't take them long when I said, no, I'm not going to be anybody's serf. They decided this guy's a mistake. So what happened? I found my first research funds. I spent my first year just teaching and in that little Halpedon office studying what I wanted to do. And there is a lesson here for you graduate students. Focus on what you really want to do. I had the opportunity to pursue what I wanted to pursue for a whole year to get started and to write my proposals, okay? In 13 months, I had an O&R grant, followed by a Basic Energy Sciences grant, which is a fundamental research grant, jointly with Sekeli. It was too late to hire graduate students, so I found an undergraduate, and I did the research with him. The two of us went in not my lab. I had to borrow space from Tony Zona, a technician, who was teaching metal sculpture. And I had always been complaining that the department would never admit anybody that was interested in welding. Harry Gatos came out of electronic materials. He would always admit the top students who were all electronic materials. That way he and Gus Witt got their pick of the litter of the new students. I got an NSF grant. And then in 1980, I did have a patron. It turns out the U.S. Navy was interested in welding ships. And they called me up, which I think is illegal nowadays. But they said, what would you do with $500,000 worth of research? Well, I'd been thinking about for a year what I'd do with that. And I knew exactly with the proposal I wanted to send them. In fact, I had already written it to the Army. I took the Army's name off it and sent it to the Navy, okay? So anyway, money was power. By that time, it was 1980 that I got that money, and I had more money than any other faculty member in the department except Bowen, Flemings, and Gatos. And they all had junior faculty members that were working for them. I was all by myself, and I didn't even have a lab, okay? So it turns out I survived, and we don't have to go through that. I guess I survived. At least I think I'm still here. Anyway, I probably ought to wrap this up. I ended up becoming Fleming's first tenure case. And there was a bit of friction between Flemings and myself because I still had this attitude. I didn't care about tenure. The whole time I had convinced myself, I don't care if MIT tenures me or not. I know what I had done. I know the quality of my work. And if MIT didn't want me, I decided, well, my career anchor is autonomy. And I could always go out and become a consultant. And so I had an option. If MIT didn't give me tenure, I would become a consultant. And it turns out over the next few years, as the Institute tried to drive me out of MIT because I was so outspoken, I just became a consultant, folks, and that's why you don't really see me much. I've been busy. I still work 80 hours a week. I've been doing it since I was 18 years old. And I actually did a lot of things for the department, but I don't have time to go through those. But I will go through it in 3371 class. If anyone wants to know, I had certain guiding principles. One principle is students are why we are here. If you don't if you're not interested in students, you can go to a national lab or a company. You also have to respect the contributions of everyone. Teaching's primary. You don't grow the department by cloning the existing faculty, but you try to grow the department on the fringes of what exists. How many times have I sat in faculty meetings and they say, oh, we need to hire someone in this area to replace so-and-so. I don't need to replace anybody. I never tried to find someone in welding. We don't need anybody in welding after me. What's there to do after me? Okay? Anyway, I learned a few lessons. One is, I heard this from Heather Leckman, gave me this, from Herman Feshbach, who is a very well-liked head of the Department of Physics. And Herman used to say, why, someone asked him why he was so well-liked. He said, never tell the faculty no, but tell them what yes means. And that's good advice I found. If you tell people what you mean about how you're going to help, you don't have to do it the way they say. You can do it your own way. And that's been actually part of my principles since I came here. I came here to do it my own way. And as I look back on it, I'm glad I did it that way. Thank you. That's just there's an Enrico Fermi quote anyone can use.
Inspiring, thank you.
Okay. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but I'm going to hang around if anybody wants questions.
Come on, someone's got to have a question. Okay, so I'll ask one. So we're this, right?
Since you have such an outspoken nature, what was your biggest regret of being outspoken?
Not holding my tongue sometimes. Okay. I was so interested in letting people know that I could say something provocative, that I could shake them up. A lot of times I should have just been quiet because most people know what the truth is. And I didn't give them time to figure it out for themselves. Yeah. Yes?
This is a very nice talk, Professor. I appreciate that you were willing to do this. For a similar premise, because you're self-spoken, if there's one thing the department could change today, and you had a magic wand that it was not doing, what would it change, or what should it change?
One of the last faculty meetings as department head, I gave a talk. There had been a war going on when I was department head between Flemings and myself. And I told him that I was not going to fight him because it would tear the department apart. But I gave a talk when I came back from visiting my daughter in Brazil, where I said that we had been having a lot of turmoil in the department, but everyone should learn to respect the opinions of everyone else. And I think that's more true today in the entire country, not just in this department. But I saw that a lot of the problems then, and I think still a number of problems now, are that people are not willing to look at things from the other person's point of view. We should be supportive of one another. We shouldn't be competing with one another. One of the problems that MIT has is we breed competition, okay? You were taught to be competitive here. And one of the things I try to do in my class is to teach the students that you're among the very best. You don't have to apologize for your gifts. What you need to do is be of service to other people and help them grow and develop. As I look at the thing that I'm most pleased with in my career, it's the students that I have taught that you don't have to be cutthroat to get ahead. And I have a lot of students who know that you can be successful without cutting each other's throats. And having respect for one another in the long term rises all ships. Okay? But I still see in this department people picking at one another. It's one of the reasons I quit going to faculty meetings. I decided They just piss me off and I piss them off, and what's the good of it, okay? I would try to say things and I realized that they didn't understand what I was saying, and it's because I didn't articulate it well enough. Okay, it's my fault. And I look back at it and I regret that, but I don't regret where I ended up. I still have my family. I tell the students in class now, MIT is not going to take care of your old age. You better take care of your family now, okay? Because MIT is not going to take care of you. Anything else? Sorry to be pontificating, but that's what I do now.
So, within MIT, which department or school do you admire the most?
It's not a department or a school, it's the people. And that's an important distinction. Julius Stratton, a president of MIT, once said he liked MIT, but he didn't love MIT. And as I look back at MIT, there's not a lot to love about this institution. But there are people here that are worth loving, okay? And caring about and serving. And those people are going to be the things that 50 years from now you're going to remember. And the reason the students like my class is I tell them stories. And the stories may not seem relevant to all of them. They probably aren't relevant to all of them. But I find by telling stories, the students liken the stories to themselves. And I make the students take my lectures and write 2 lines about what they learned in the lecture. And when you read these lectures, you read these students' comments, you wouldn't believe they were in the same lecture. Because everybody writes what they got out of the lecture. And that's more important to teach than teaching you how to solve some equation. I realized that in 1989. I started thinking, what do I remember from my undergraduate years? I remember the stories that John Wolfe used to tell us, okay? And so around 1990, I started just telling stories, okay? Because that's what I remember. I didn't remember how to derive e to the x dx, although I think I can. But anyway, okay. Those weren't the important things. And the reason I chose this topic is because the important thing is actually the people in this room and the other people that you meet at MIT and the relationships you develop with them. And for a faculty member, it's the students that you help educate. One of my most frustrating things about MIT is the fact that MIT panders to the students. They don't treat them like adults. I've always told my students that we're supposed to be teaching them to be professionals. You treat them like professionals and they will act like professionals. You treat them like children and they will act like children. And I see that all the time. And unfortunately, the best way to quit treating them like children is to fire most of the people in the Dean for Student Affairs office, okay? Those are the types of things I used to say all the time. And if you want to quote me as the Dean for Student, it's okay, I don't mind being quoted. I hope they will come back and hear that and challenge me on it.
We've got one more question.
You mentioned that you were like the first faculty to get tenure without a financial sponsor. How did things change after that happened? Like, is that still the way it works today? Or?
Well, I maybe skipped over that. When I found out that one day about my $50 first year budget, I went back to that little Hobbiton office and I said, oh, so that's the way it is, sink or swim. Well, I'm going to try to swim, and if I swim, I will make sure no one ever goes through this again. And in fact, 2 years later, I'd helped mentor Don Sadoway, and Don Sadoway didn't really have a financial patron, okay? And in fact, when Flemings came in, he tried to create career development committees. He did a lot of good things about helping the junior faculty. And those have all been great things. And I hope that the department will realize that the purpose of the senior faculty is to mentor the junior faculty, and the purpose of the junior faculty is to mentor the students. And the purpose of the students is to go out there and change the world for the better. Okay. And if anyone wants to get the 3371 follow-ons and stuff, they're going to be available. I post them all on YouTube eventually.